Sarah Martinez stood in her father's garage, oil stains covering her old jeans and grease under her fingernails. She was only 12 years old, but she could take apart a car engine faster than most grown men. Her father, Miguel, watched with pride as she carefully cleaned each spark plug and checked every wire connection. The small town of Cedar Creek, Texas had only 3,000 people. Most girls her age spent their afternoons at the mall or talking about boys. But Sarah was different. She preferred the smell of motor oil to perfume and the sound of engines to pop music. While her classmates painted their nails, Sarah painted model airplanes in her bedroom. Her room was filled with airplane posters and books about flying. She had read every aviation magazine in the town library twice. On her desk sat dozens of perfectly built model planes. Some were fighter jets, others were passenger planes, but each one was painted with careful detail. Sarah knew the name and specifications of every aircraft that had ever flown. Every evening after helping her father at the garage, Sarah would climb onto the roof of their small house. She would lie on her back and watch the planes fly overhead. The nearest airport was 50 miles away, but she could still see the tiny dots moving across the sky. She would close her eyes and imagine herself in the cockpit, soaring through clouds and feeling the freedom that only flying could bring. Her mother Rosa worried about Sarah's unusual interests. One day she sat down next to her daughter who was reading a book about military aircraft. Rosa gently touched Sarah's shoulder and said, "Mija, why don't you play with dolls like other girls? Flying is not for people like us. We are simple people who fix cars and work with our hands." Sarah looked up from her book with determined eyes. "Mama, I don't want to be like other girls. I want to fly. I want to touch the clouds and see the world from up high. I know we don't have much money, but I will find a way." Her father, Miguel, overheard the conversation from the kitchen. He walked over and sat down beside his wife and daughter. His hands were still dirty from working on Mrs. Johnson's old pickup truck. He looked at Sarah seriously and said, "If you want to fly, then you must study hard and never give up. Dreams don't come easy, but they are possible if you work for them." At school, Sarah's dreams seemed impossible. Her teachers were kind but practical. They encouraged her to think about realistic careers like nursing or teaching. When she was 15, she met with her guidance counselor, Mr. Peterson, to discuss her future plans. His office was filled with college brochures for local universities. Mr. Peterson shuffled through Sarah's excellent grades and test scores. He nodded approvingly and said, "Sarah, you have wonderful grades. You could get a scholarship to study, education or business. What do you think about becoming a teacher?" Sarah took a deep breath and said, "Actually, Mr. Peterson, I want to apply to the Air Force Academy. I want to become a fighter pilot." The counselor's face showed complete surprise. He put down her papers and stared at her for several seconds. Then he started laughing, not in a mean way, but like someone had told him a funny joke. "Sarah, that's very ambitious, but girls like you don't become fighter pilots. That's for people with connections, people from military families, people with lots of money. You should focus on something more realistic." But Sarah had inherited her father's stubbornness and her mother's quiet strength. She left Mr. Peterson's office more determined than ever. That afternoon, she walked to the town's small airport. It was really just a grass strip where crop dusters and small private planes landed. She found the owner, Jim Wilson, working on an old Cessna. Jim was 70 years old and had been flying for 50 years. He had short gray hair and hands that showed decades of working with aircraft. Sarah approached him nervously and asked, "Mr. Wilson, could you teach me how to fly? I can work for you after school and on weekends to pay for lessons." Jim looked at the determined teenager standing before him. Most kids who wanted flying lessons gave up after a few weeks when they realized how much work was involved. But something in Sarah's eyes told him she was different. Flying lessons cost $60 per hour, and you need at least 40 hours before you can get your license. That's $2,400, not counting books and test fees. Can you afford that? Sarah's heart sank. $2,400 was more money than her family saw in several months. But she didn't give up. "What if I work for you? I can clean planes, help with maintenance, answer phones, whatever you need. I learn fast and I work hard." Jim thought about it for a moment. His small airport operation could use help, and he had always believed in giving young people chances. "All right, Sarah, you work for me 20 hours a week and I'll give you one flying lesson each week. But if your grades drop or you miss work, the deal is off. Flying requires discipline in everything you do." Sarah's face lit up with the biggest smile Jim had ever seen. She shook his weathered hand and said, "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I promise. You won't regret this. I'm going to be the best student you've ever had." That evening, Sarah ran all the way home. She burst through the front door, still breathing hard from her run. Her parents were sitting at their small kitchen table, paying bills and looking worried about money as they did every month. "Mama, Papa," Sarah said excitedly, "I found someone to teach me how to fly. I'm going to work at the airport and learn to be a pilot." Miguel looked up from the stack of bills and smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. Rosa shook her head with concern, but also with pride. They both knew that their daughter was different, that she had dreams bigger than their small town. They also knew that Sarah had the determination to make those dreams come true, no matter how impossible they seemed to everyone else. The advanced combat training phase began 6 months after Sarah received her Eagle-7 call sign. This was where future fighter pilots learned to think like warriors and fly like hunters. The training moved from basic flying skills to combat tactics, weapon systems, and life-or-death decision-making. Only the top students made it this far, and even fewer would earn the right to fly fighter jets. Sarah found herself under constant observation. Every move she made was watched and judged more carefully than her male classmates. When she executed a perfect barrel roll during dogfight training, instructors asked if she had practiced that maneuver before. When her targeting accuracy exceeded program standards, they wondered if the simulation equipment was working properly. When she remained calm under pressure that made other students panic, they questioned whether she truly understood the dangers she faced. The night navigation exercise became Sarah's first major test. Students had to fly their training aircraft through a complex course in complete darkness, using only instruments and radio guidance. The course included mountain terrain, restricted airspace, and weather conditions that changed every few minutes. Many experienced pilots considered night navigation one of the most challenging skills in aviation. Sarah's flight group included 8 students, and she was the only woman. They gathered in the briefing room at 8 in the evening, studying weather reports and flight maps under dim red lights that would not affect their night vision. The course looked like a maze of dangerous obstacles and precise timing requirements. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, their instructor, explained the mission. "Tonight you will fly solo through the Rocky Mountain training area. You must hit 6 navigation points in exact sequence while avoiding civilian air traffic and military restricted zones. The weather includes thunderstorms, high winds, and possible icing conditions." 3 students failed this exercise last week. 2 crashed in the simulator and 1 got so lost we had to send a search plane to find him. When the briefing ended, Sarah felt confident but nervous. She had always been good with maps and navigation, and her instrument flying skills were excellent. But she also knew that one mistake could end her dream of becoming a fighter pilot. The first student to fly was Marcus Thompson, whose call sign was Thunder. He had been flying since he was 12 and came from a family of Air Force generals. Sarah watched on the control room monitors as Thunder's aircraft disappeared into the dark mountain terrain. Within 30 minutes, his voice came over the radio sounding confused and worried. "Control tower, this is Thunder. I think I missed navigation point 3. My GPS shows I'm 15 miles off course and I'm running low on fuel." The instructor had to guide Thunder back to base, marking a failure on his training record. The second student, called Blazer, crashed his simulator when he tried to fly through a thunderstorm instead of around it. The third student completed the course but missed 2 navigation points and arrived 20 minutes late. When Sarah's turn came, she walked to her aircraft feeling the weight of everyone's expectations. Some instructors gathered in the control tower to watch her flight, which was unusual for a routine training exercise. She knew they were waiting to see if Eagle-7 would succeed or become another example of why women did not belong in fighter aircraft. Sarah started her engines and taxied to the runway as darkness settled over the base. The tower cleared her for takeoff and she accelerated into the black sky. Within minutes, she was alone with only her instruments and radio for guidance. The mountains below were invisible, but she could sense their presence through small changes in air pressure and wind patterns. The first navigation point came quickly. Sarah's timing was perfect, and she reported her position exactly on schedule. The second point required a sharp turn through a narrow valley, but she had studied the terrain map so carefully that she could picture every ridge and peak. Her aircraft sliced through the darkness like it was daylight. The real challenge came at navigation point 4, where a sudden thunderstorm had developed since the weather briefing. Lightning flashed around her aircraft and turbulence shook the plane so hard that her instruments became difficult to read. Rain pounded against the windscreen and ice began forming on the wings. Sarah had two choices. She could go around the storm, which would make her late and possibly cause her to miss the remaining navigation points. Or she could thread her way through the storm using a narrow corridor of calmer air she had spotted on her weather radar. Most pilots would have chosen the safe option and gone around the storm. But Sarah remembered her father's words about dreams requiring hard work and never giving up. She chose the dangerous path through the storm. For 10 terrifying minutes, Sarah flew through conditions that would challenge experienced airline captains. Lightning struck near her aircraft twice and hail pounded the metal skin like machine gun fire, but she maintained perfect control, adjusting her course constantly to stay in the safest air while never losing sight of her navigation goals. When she emerged from the storm, Sarah was exactly on course and on time. The remaining navigation points passed smoothly, and she landed back at base with fuel to spare. Her flight time was the best of the evening, and she had hit every navigation point with precision that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. But instead of celebration, Sarah faced questions during her debriefing. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes studied her flight data with a puzzled expression. "Martinez, your navigation accuracy tonight was exceptional. Your decision to fly through that storm was either brilliant or reckless. How did you know you could make it through safely?" Sarah answered honestly. "Sir, I studied the weather patterns and radar images carefully. I saw a corridor of less severe weather that would allow passage if flown precisely. The risk was calculated, not careless." Another instructor, Major Williams, shook his head. "That kind of aggressive flying might work in training, but real combat requires following procedures and playing it safe." Sarah felt frustration building in her chest. When male students took risks and succeeded, they were called bold and innovative. When she did the same thing, they questioned her judgment and called her reckless. But she kept her voice calm and respectful. "Yes, sir. I understand the importance of following procedures, but I also understand that combat pilots sometimes face situations where textbook answers are not enough." That night, Sarah overheard two instructors talking in the hallway outside her room. One said, "Eagle-7's flying tonight was impressive, but I wonder if she really understands what she's getting into. Fighter combat is not a place for show-offs." Sarah closed her door quietly and sat on her bed, feeling more alone than ever. No matter how well she performed, some people would always find reasons to doubt her abilities and question her place in the program. 3 years had passed since Sarah first stepped into the cockpit of Jim Wilson's old training plane. Now she stood at the gates of Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, wearing her crisp new uniform and carrying everything she owned in 2 small bags. At 19 years old, Sarah Martinez had made it further than anyone in Cedar Creek thought possible. She had earned her private pilot license, graduated high school with perfect grades, and somehow convinced the Air Force Academy Selection Board that a small-town mechanic's daughter deserved a chance. The flight training program was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. She was surrounded by young men and women who came from military families, wealthy backgrounds, and elite colleges. Many had been flying expensive aircraft since they were children. Their fathers were generals, their mothers were senators, and their bank accounts had more zeros than Sarah's family made in a year. On her first day, Sarah met her roommate Jennifer Park, whose father was a retired Air Force colonel and whose mother was a NASA engineer. Jennifer had attended private boarding schools and summer flight camps that cost more than Sarah's father made in 6 months. Despite their different backgrounds, Jennifer was kind and helped Sarah understand the unwritten rules of military life. The training began before sunrise every day. Physical fitness, classroom instruction, simulator time, and actual flight training filled every hour. Sarah discovered she had natural abilities that surprised even the instructors. Her hands moved smoothly on the controls, her eyes tracked multiple instruments without effort, and her mind processed flight information faster than most of her classmates. During formation flying exercises, Sarah could maintain perfect position even in turbulent weather. When other students struggled with instrument navigation, she found her way through clouds and storms like she had been born to fly. Her precision landing scores were the highest in her class, and her reaction times during emergency simulations impressed veteran pilots who had seen hundreds of students come and go. But Sarah's success created problems she had not expected. Some of her fellow students began to whisper that she was only there to fill the military's requirement for more women pilots. Others suggested that her high scores were the result of instructors going easy on her. The whispers followed her into the dining hall, the study rooms, and even the chapel where she went to find peace. Captain Rodriguez, one of the senior training instructors, noticed Sarah's exceptional performance during a challenging weather flying exercise. While 3 male students had to abort their landings due to crosswinds, Sarah brought her training aircraft down perfectly in conditions that would challenge experienced pilots. After the debrief, Captain Rodriguez pulled her aside. "Martinez, your flying today was outstanding. I've been instructing for 12 years and I've rarely seen natural skill like yours. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here." But, despite her instructor's recognition, the doubt from some classmates continued. During study sessions, she would overhear comments about diversity quotas and lowered standards. Some students joked that the Air Force was so desperate for female pilots that they would accept anyone. These words hurt Sarah more than she let anyone know, but they also made her more determined to prove herself. The most important day of flight training came during the 6th month when students received their call signs. These special names were a sacred tradition in military aviation. Pilots carried their call signs throughout their entire careers, and the names often reflected their personality, flying style, or memorable moments during training. The ceremony took place in the squadron ready room, where portraits of famous pilots lined the walls. Each student stood before their classmates and instructors while their call sign was announced. Sarah watched as her friends received names like Rocket for his speed, Steady for her calm flying style, and Phoenix for surviving a difficult simulator emergency. When Sarah's turn came, the room grew quiet. Major Thompson, the squadron commander, opened her file and smiled. "Student Martinez, your flying skills, leadership potential, and dedication to excellence have earned you the call sign Eagle-7. Eagles represent the finest qualities of military aviation, soaring above challenges and striking with precision. You have earned your place among the elite." Sarah felt pride swell in her chest. The eagle was America's symbol of freedom and strength. To be called Eagle-7 should have been the greatest honor of her life. But as she looked around the room, she saw different expressions on her classmates' faces. Some smiled and applauded genuinely. Others looked skeptical or even annoyed. After the ceremony, Sarah overheard a group of male students talking near the snack machines. One of them, whose call sign was Viper, was complaining loudly. "Eagle-7? Really? They're giving out Eagle call signs to diversity hires now? My grandfather flew Eagles in World War II, and he earned that name by shooting down enemy fighters." Another student called Thunderbolt joined in. "The number 7 probably represents how many tries it took her to pass her first solo flight. I heard the instructors have been going easy on the female students to make sure they graduate." Sarah walked past them without saying anything, but their words felt like physical blows. She had worked harder than anyone in her class. Her scores were higher than both Viper and Thunderbolt. She had never failed a single test or needed extra attempts at any flying maneuver. But their doubt made her question herself for the first time since arriving at flight training. That night, Sarah sat alone in her room, staring at the new name tag that read Eagle-7. Jennifer found her there an hour later, looking sad and confused. "What's wrong, Sarah? You should be celebrating. Eagle-7 is an incredible call sign." Sarah looked up with tears in her eyes. "Maybe they're right, Jen. Maybe I am just here to fill a quota. Maybe the instructors have been going easy on me. Jennifer sat down beside her friend and put a hand on her shoulder. Sarah, I've watched you fly. I've seen your test scores. You're not here because you're a woman. You're here because you're one of the best pilots in this program. Don't let their insecurity make you doubt what you've earned. But the damage was done. Sarah went to sleep that night knowing that her call sign, which should have filled her with pride, would forever be questioned by some people who believed she did not deserve to wear the wings of an eagle. 6 months before graduation, an unexpected crisis tested every pilot trainee at Randolph Air Force Base. Sarah was studying in the library when alarms began blaring throughout the base. Emergency lights flashed in the hallways and loudspeakers crackled with urgent announcements calling all flight instructors to the command center immediately. Within an hour, word spread among the students about what was happening. A civilian medical transport aircraft carrying critical supplies to a remote hospital in the Colorado mountains had disappeared during a severe winter storm. The small plane was carrying blood supplies, emergency medicines, and a heart surgeon who was rushing to perform life-saving surgery on a child. The weather conditions were unlike anything pilots had seen in years. Wind speeds exceeded 80 miles per hour, with snow so heavy that visibility was near zero. Mountain peaks were completely hidden by thick clouds, and temperature readings showed ice forming on aircraft within minutes of takeoff. Commercial lie. Airlines had grounded all flights and even military helicopters were unable to fly in the dangerous conditions. Sarah joined other students gathered around the weather monitors in the main briefing room. The storm system stretched across 3 states with the worst conditions centered exactly where the missing aircraft had last been seen on radar. Search and rescue teams on the ground were making no progress through the deep snow and treacherous mountain terrain. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, addressed the assembled group of instructors and students. His face showed the stress of knowing that lives hung in the balance while precious time slipped away. The missing aircraft contains medical supplies that a child needs to survive surgery tonight. We have maybe 4 hours before it becomes too late to save this young patient. He pointed to the weather display showing swirling storm clouds and dangerous wind patterns. Helicopter rescue teams cannot operate in these conditions. Transport. Aircraft cannot handle the mountain winds and turbulence. We need a small, fast, maneuverable aircraft flown by a pilot with exceptional skills and nerves of steel. The room fell completely silent. Everyone understood what the colonel was suggesting. This mission would require a fighter-style aircraft, flown by someone willing to risk their life in conditions that had already claimed one airplane. It was not a training exercise or simulation. Real people were dying while they stood in the warm briefing room. Colonel Martinez continued speaking, in his serious command voice. I am asking for volunteer pilots who believe they have the skills necessary to fly this search and rescue mission. The dangers are real and immediate. Wind shear could tear an aircraft apart. Ice formation could cause engine failure. Navigation will be nearly impossible with zero visibility. Anyone who volunteers must understand that this mission could end their career or their life. The room remained quiet for several long minutes. Sarah looked around at her fellow students, many of whom had been flying longer and came from military families with generations of combat experience. These were the same students who had questioned her abilities and suggested she did not deserve her Eagle-7 call sign. Marcus Thompson, whose call sign was Thunder, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had crashed his simulator during the night, navigation exercise, and had struggled with difficult weather conditions throughout his training. Jennifer Park, Sarah's roommate and friend, looked pale as she studied the weather report showing conditions worse than anything they had practiced. David Chen, called Viper, who had often made jokes about Sarah's flying abilities, stared at the floor and said nothing. Kevin Walsh, whose call sign was Thunderbolt, kept shaking his head as he read the wind speed measurements and visibility reports. Sarah felt her heart racing as she considered the mission requirements. Everything about this rescue attempt was dangerous and difficult. The weather was worse than anything she had experienced. The mountain terrain was unfamiliar and deadly. Navigation would require skills that most pilots never developed. Landing, or even finding the crash site, would be nearly impossible. But Sarah also thought about the child waiting for surgery and the medical team trapped somewhere in the freezing mountains. She remembered her father working late into the night to fix someone's car so they could get to the hospital. She thought about her mother staying up with sick neighbors when doctors were too far away to help. Sarah stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room focus on her. Her voice was steady and clear as she spoke. "Colonel Martinez, sir, I request permission to volunteer for this mission. I believe I have the skills and training necessary to locate the missing aircraft and guide rescue teams to the survivors." The silence in the room was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. Colonel Martinez studied her face carefully, reading her determination and confidence. He had watched her training progress and knew her flight scores were among the best in the program. But this was not about test scores or training exercises. This was about life and death. Several instructors began whispering among themselves. Some pointed at weather reports and shook their heads. Others reviewed Sarah's training records on their tablets. The debate continued for several minutes while Sarah stood at attention, waiting for an answer that would define her entire military career. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Sarah's primary flight instructor, approached the colonel and spoke quietly in his ear. Sarah could not hear their conversation, but she saw Hayes nodding seriously and pointing at her training files. Other instructors joined the discussion, examining flight data and test results. Finally, Colonel Martinez looked directly at Sarah and spoke in his official command voice. "Student Martinez, this mission will test every skill you have learned and some you have not yet discovered. The aircraft you will fly is faster and more complex than anything in your training experience. The weather conditions are beyond what we normally consider flyable. The terrain is unforgiving of even small mistakes." Sarah maintained eye contact with the colonel and replied, "Sir, I understand the risks and accept full responsibility for this mission. Those people need help, and I believe I can find them and bring them home safely." The colonel studied her face for one final moment, then made the decision that would change Sarah's life forever. "Very well, Eagle-7. You are authorized to fly this search and rescue mission. May God go with you and guide you safely through the storm." Sarah sat in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, the most advanced aircraft she had ever flown. Rain pounded against the canopy like bullets, and wind rocked the 20-ton fighter jet as if it were a toy airplane. The storm had grown worse in the past hour, and weather reports showed conditions that would keep commercial pilots on the ground for days. Her hands moved across the instrument panel, checking every system with practiced precision. The F-16 was faster and more powerful than the training aircraft she was used to flying. But the basic principles remained the same. She had studied the flight manual for 2 hours while mechanics prepared the aircraft, memorizing every switch and procedure. Through her headset, Sarah heard the voices of air traffic controllers, weather specialists, and rescue coordinators, discussing her mission. Everyone knew this was a desperate attempt to save lives when no other options remained. The missing medical aircraft had been on the ground somewhere in the Colorado mountains for 6 hours. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding survivors. Colonel Martinez's voice came through the radio clearly despite the storm interference. "Eagle-7, you are cleared for takeoff when ready. Weather conditions at your destination remain severe with winds gusting to 90 miles per hour and visibility less than 1/4 mile. Mountain rescue teams are standing by to follow your navigation once you locate the crash site." Sarah took a deep breath and responded with confidence she had never felt before. "Control tower, this is Eagle-7. All systems are green and ready for departure. I will find those people and guide rescue teams to their location." The tower controller, a veteran who had guided thousands of flights, wished her luck with obvious emotion in his voice. "Eagle-7, you are cleared for takeoff. Bring them home safely, pilot." Sarah pushed the throttle forward and the F-16's powerful engine roared to life. The aircraft accelerated down the runway faster than anything she had ever experienced. Within seconds, she was airborne and climbing into the black storm clouds that had defeated every other rescue attempt. Flying through the storm was like being inside a washing machine filled with lightning and ice. Turbulence threw the fighter jet in every direction, and Sarah had to use all her strength to maintain control. Rain and hail created a deafening noise against the aircraft's skin. Lightning strikes lit up the cockpit like camera flashes, temporarily blinding her instruments. But Sarah had trained for exactly these conditions. Every hour she had spent practicing instrument flying in bad weather prepared her for this moment. Her hands remained steady on the controls, making constant small adjustments to keep the aircraft stable. Her eyes moved across the instrument panel in the precise pattern her instructors had taught her, gathering information and making decisions faster than conscious thought. As she flew deeper into the mountain region, the weather became even more dangerous. Ice began forming on her wings, adding weight and reducing lift. The aircraft's de-icing system worked constantly to prevent a catastrophic loss of control. Wind shear from the mountain peaks created invisible walls of air that could flip an aircraft upside down without warning. Sarah used every navigation skill she had learned during her training. GPS signals were unreliable in the storm, so she relied on older techniques involving radio beacons and dead reckoning navigation. She calculated wind drift, adjusted for magnetic variations, and maintained precise headings despite turbulence that would have overwhelmed less experienced pilots. After flying for an hour through conditions that seemed impossible to survive, Sarah spotted something unusual on her radar display. A small metallic object appeared briefly between the mountain peaks, exactly where the missing aircraft should have crashed according to its last known position. Sarah descended carefully through layers of clouds and storm activity, using her aircraft's advanced sensors to penetrate the darkness and snow. As she flew lower, her radio picked up a faint emergency signal from the crash site. The medical team was alive, but trapped in their damaged aircraft on a narrow mountain ledge. Finding. The crash site was only the beginning of Sarah's mission. The real challenge was marking the location, so rescue helicopters could find it once the storm passed. Sarah circled the area repeatedly, taking precise navigation readings and photographing the terrain with her aircraft's cameras. But the storm was getting worse and fuel levels were becoming a concern. Sarah had enough gas to return to base safely, but she knew the rescue teams needed more information about the crash site location and the condition of the survivors. Against all safety protocols, Sarah descended even lower, flying her F-16 through mountain valleys in zero visibility. She used her aircraft's lights to signal the crash survivors and her radio to establish direct communication with the trapped medical team. The doctor reported that everyone was alive but injured, and the child patient desperately needed the medical supplies they were carrying. Sarah spent another 30 minutes mapping the exact crash location and identifying the safest approach routes for rescue helicopters. She transmitted detailed coordinates, weather observations, and landing zone information to the Rescue Coordination Center. Only when she was certain that rescue teams had everything they needed did she begin her dangerous flight back to base. Then a return trip through the storm tested every skill Sarah had developed during 2 years of training. Low fuel levels meant she could not waste energy fighting the turbulence, so she had to find smooth air pockets and ride them like ocean currents. Navigation required constant calculations as wind pushed her aircraft off course. When Sarah finally emerged from the storm clouds and saw the lights of Randolph Air Force Base, she felt exhaustion and relief flooding through her body. She had been flying for 3 hours in conditions that would challenge pilots with decades of experience. Her hands were sore from gripping the controls, and her eyes burned from staring at instruments in the lightning-filled darkness. The landing approach was the most difficult part of the entire mission. Crosswinds from the storm tried to push her F-16 sideways off the runway. Rain made the landing strip slippery and dangerous, but Sarah had practiced thousands of landings during her training, and muscle memory guided her safely to the ground. As Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, she was surprised to see dozens of people waiting for her on the flight line. Students, instructors, mechanics, and base personnel stood in the rain and wind, applauding her successful return. Colonel Martinez approached with a smile that showed both relief and pride. Outstanding work, Eagle-7. Rescue helicopters are already en route to the coordinates you provided. The weather is clearing and we expect to have those people safely evacuated within 2 hours. Among the crowd, Sarah saw the faces of students who had questioned her abilities and suggested she did not deserve her call sign. Marcus Thompson, David Chen, and Kevin Walsh stood with expressions of genuine respect and admiration. They had watched her volunteer for a mission they were afraid to attempt, and they had seen her succeed where they might have failed. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, her primary instructor, shook Sarah's hand with obvious emotion. "Martinez, what you accomplished tonight was exceptional flying under impossible conditions. You didn't just prove that you deserve the call sign Eagle-7. You proved that you understand what it truly means to soar above every challenge." 2 days later, news arrived that the rescue mission had been completely successful. All survivors were safely evacuated from the mountain crash site, and the child patient received life-saving surgery using the medical supplies Sarah had helped locate. The story of Eagle-7's flight through the storm became legendary throughout the Air Force training community. From that night forward, no one ever again questioned whether Sarah Martinez deserved to be called Eagle-7. She had earned her wings, not through quotas or lowered standards, but through courage, skill, and an unwavering determination to serve others regardless of personal risk. The Eagle had truly learned to soar,